Jen. I should announce it. What is it? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this presidential symposium. I'm really excited to do this. This is one of the perks, as I said, about being president. You get to come up with your own presidential lecture. And so the topic I wanted to discuss was the impact of cigarette smoking on other substance use disorders, because as you'll see in our overall argument, we feel that it's not sufficiently addressed, the impact of cigarette smoking on other substance use disorders. So I'm very happy to have my fellow speakers here who agreed to come to this lecture, because like CBDD, we're really trying to show the breadth of this discussion. So we have merely basic science, preclinical, human lab, epidemiology, and then kind of an overall discussion. So let me get underway, because I just want to really introduce how I fell into this, because I am not, I didn't come into this terribly interested in cigarette smoking per se. So what I'm going to describe, I'm a cannabis researcher. I've been studying in the human laboratory the effects of cannabis for over 20 years. So I'm going to show you how I fell into tobacco and describe tobacco's effects on cannabis self-administration and the role of the age of tobacco onset on this relationship and some of the implications. So just to start with cannabis use disorder, we have a human laboratory model of cannabis use disorder, and it's really the translational bridge between preclinical studies and randomized controlled clinical trials, where we can, in a small number of subjects, test the effects of medications that may potentially be used to improve cannabis treatment. And we look at the effects of medications on behaviors that are our working hypothesis is that they're predictive of clinical efficacy, and it's really cannabis self-administration, cannabis withdrawal, and abuse-related subjective effects, like how cannabis affects ratings of high and liking and good drug effect. So we have we use within subjects, double-blind, inpatient design. These are non-treatment seeking daily cannabis smokers, and they're heavy cannabis smokers. They do not miss a day. They wake up and start smoking, and they're averaging about 2 to 4 grams a day. Not interested in treatment for it. They don't have any other psychiatric disorders and no other substance use disorders except tobacco use. Tobacco use disorder was not exclusionary. But their use of other drugs is extremely low. Their use of cannabis is very, very high. So they move into our residential laboratory setting, and we measure their behavior around the clock while they're smoking placebo and active cannabis and while they're taking placebo and active medication. So we're measuring their mood, their sleep, their food intake, drug craving, their cognitive task performance, and cannabis self-administration. And this just shows, I don't know if I have what the laboratory looks like. They each have their own room, and we control how they smoke cannabis with lights on the ceiling that tells them when they can light the cigarette and how long they can inhale and how long they hold the smoke in their lungs. So it's fairly controlled, and we measure how many puffs they're smoking as one of our endpoints. So let me just, I don't know, I don't have a pointer, right? Do I have a pointer? No. I don't think I do. So this is just, again, to describe the design, because it's important to the points I want to make about the impact of tobacco cigarettes. So again, not thinking about tobacco at all, we've done a whole series of studies, placebo-controlled studies, where we bring, again, these participants into the laboratory. Their first day in the laboratory, in a controlled way, I'm having them smoke cannabis repeatedly throughout the day, and then I could see what effect the medication has on how intoxicated they get, for example. Thank you so much. For the next 3 days, they have the opportunity to self-administer cannabis, but it's placebo cannabis. It has 0% THC in it. Now, to self-administer, they have to pay for puffs of cannabis. If it were free, even if it were placebo, they would typically self-administer as much as they possibly could. So I impose a little price on them to have them weigh whether they're going to choose to self-administer or not, because I want to see a medication that might shift a behavior from choosing to self-administer to not. So for these 3 days, they're they have the opportunity to self-administer placebo cannabis. Whether they do or don't, it gives me the opportunity to measure cannabis withdrawal symptoms. Cannabis withdrawal is typically irritability, anxiety, disrupted food intake, and disrupted sleep. And it's pretty uncomfortable. But we could see then the effects of medication on cannabis withdrawal. But my behavior of most interest, sorry, I've got 2 different screens, is whether they choose to self-administer active cannabis. So on day 5, they have the chance to purchase individual puffs of active cannabis. So they go through these 8 days while they're on placebo medication and on various doses of active medication. So we could see the effects of medication on these 3 different aspects of behavior: intoxication, withdrawal, and relapse. And so we've done more medications than this, but we've tested the effects of a lot of medications using this design. And so it occurred to me that at one point we could really look to see what predicts, what predicts the likelihood that participants will relapse to cannabis. So we collapsed data from the placebo phase of 5 different studies, and interestingly, we found that half relapsed and half did not. We had no idea what the numbers would look like. So this kind of shows that my imposing a cost does have, it separates the group a little bit. So some will choose to pay money, and it's expensive to self-administer marijuana, and some will not. And so we were surprised, first of all, that it split so evenly, and because, again, appearance-wise, the participants all look extremely similar. It's a pretty homogeneous group, so we were a little surprised by that. So we thought, well, we have so much data on them. What predicted the odds that an abstinent cannabis smoker would relapse to cannabis use? We have detailed data on cannabis intoxication, on withdrawal, and on a whole slew of demographic variables. And so these are just the variables we looked at. So how old they were, when they started smoking marijuana, how much they smoked, how much alcohol they drink, how many cannabis cigarettes they smoked per day, so forth. We also looked at how high they got on that day that I gave them controlled amounts of cannabis, and we looked at cannabis withdrawal symptoms. So my working hypothesis going into this was that it was going to be the severity of withdrawal that predicted how likely people would be to relapse to cannabis under placebo medication conditions. And so the question, what predicts who will relapse? The answer is tobacco cigarette smoking. Most robust finding I've ever had, and completely surprising to me. It was not at all what I was predicting. So we found that tobacco smokers had markedly higher rates of cannabis relapse in the laboratory relative to those who did not use tobacco. So it was a 61% versus 15% high odds ratio. Importantly, in the laboratory, they're free to smoke tobacco cigarettes, so it's not as though they were going through any kind of tobacco withdrawal. They were smoking as much as they wanted in the laboratory. Yet, if they were a smoker, they were much more likely to relapse to cannabis. So again, this is one of the fun times in science where you're completely surprised, and it just opens up a whole new range of questions that I never would have thought of. There's many explanations as to why this might be the case, but one is perhaps tobacco cigarettes directly increase the likelihood of cannabis use. I mean, it could be condition cues, it could be the direct effects of nicotine, that could be one explanation. If so, then rates of cannabis self-administration should be higher when cannabis smokers are smoking tobacco as usual, the SAU condition, than when they're abstinent from tobacco. So we compared our laboratory measure of cannabis relapse in the same individuals. When they were smoking as usual, they would move into the lab and go through the whole procedure. And again, we counterbalanced this, but then they would also we would use contingency management to have them quit smoking tobacco for several days prior to moving into the lab. And then while they were in the lab, they wouldn't have any access to tobacco cigarettes. So that was the quit condition. So same individuals, the only thing we were varying is their cigarette smoking. And again, they had to quit and give us a low cotinine before moving into the lab. And so what we found is it had no effect. So their rates of cannabis relapse were very, very high. Oh, interestingly, they did, under that placebo cannabis condition, they did pay to smoke more placebo cannabis cigarettes under the quit condition. They were just desperate to smoke something, I think. But the active cannabis condition, it didn't matter whether they were smoking cigarettes or not. Over 87% of the participants relapsed to cannabis, whether they were in the SAU condition or the quit phase. So cigarettes also, just as an aside, had no impact on cannabis intoxication or cannabis withdrawal for the most part. There was one or two small effects on mood, but in general, cigarettes didn't really change the effects of cannabis at all. So this was one answer to this big puzzle, that we don't think that short-term tobacco cessation did not seem to reduce that strong association between cigarette smoking and our laboratory measure of cannabis relapse. So, of course, then this opened up a whole new literature which completely is consistent with this story that I had no knowledge of until we found this effect. It's consistent with all the epidemiological evidence suggesting that current tobacco cigarette smoking is a clinically important marker for increased risk of cannabis relapse. And so, one of the other invited speakers, Renee Goodwin, is going to be speaking about this. And it's not unique to cannabis. This seems to be true for all substance use disorders. So we followed this up. We specifically recruited a group of both cannabis and tobacco smokers exclusively. Before, we were just recruiting cannabis smokers, and it turned out that about 75% of them happened to smoke cigarettes as well. For this study, we specifically recruited cannabis and tobacco smokers, and we wanted to test the effects of varenicline or Chantix alone and when combined with nabilone, which is a cannabinoid agonist, to see if we could both target the cigarette smoking and the cannabis withdrawal symptoms to see if in this population we would be able to significantly decrease our measure of cannabis relapse. And that's the focus of another talk. But in addition to doing that, because of our other findings, we also decided to look at predictors of cannabis relapse in this population. So we did the factor analysis again. It's a small number of 41 people, but we repeated this. I give credit to Evan Herman, who was working with us at the time, and this just came out in Addiction Biology. And he found a really interesting relationship between age of first tobacco cigarette use as a robust predictor of cannabis relapse. So in a population of cannabis smokers and tobacco smokers, those who started smoking tobacco at a young age, less than 16, were much more likely to relapse to cannabis use. So all of them were smoking at the same rate, but the younger age had a much bigger impact on their likelihood of relapsing to cannabis use. Now, this is consistent with preclinical data, and another one of our invited speakers, Amir Levine, is going to be talking about this relationship, the impact of nicotine exposure really in adolescence. And because it's a very vulnerable period of drug exposure. There's major neurobiological maturation of brain regions critical for reward processing, learning and memory, and executive function. And it's sensitive, this time period, to persistent alterations by drugs. So the implications right now, as we heard this morning, of the decrease in tobacco cigarette smoking, but the increase in e-cigarette use and that really profound impact of nicotine at that time period, interesting implications for the development of other substance use disorders potentially. So, one of the takeaways I'd like to have you walk out with is, why don't we treat tobacco smoking as a comorbidity as we do other polydrug use? Tobacco cigarette smoking, in my impression, has been overlooked in substance use disorder research, and it's really, I'm sure, in part for practical reasons. Heavy drug users have much higher rates of cigarette smoking than non-drug users. So finding healthy controls matched for tobacco use and only differing in their other drug use from your population of interest is really difficult, at least in New York City. It's, whenever we've tried to do matched controlled studies with heavy cocaine users or cannabis smokers, and you're trying to match for everything, so cigarette smoking and so forth, and the only difference being whether they're using cannabis or cocaine or not, we can't find that population in New York. We cannot find psychiatrically healthy cigarette smokers who are not using other drugs of abuse. So So that just is a practical problem. To do these match control studies and really control for cigarette smoking is difficult. So, but if you don't, it's really it's impossible to isolate your drug of interest from nicotine. Nicotine is likely contributing importantly to both our understanding of the neurobiological mechanisms of substance use disorders, treatment and prevention of substance use disorders, as you'll hear. So, our ongoing studies are really looking at the impact of following up on that early versus late tobacco use story that we seem to have found in our recent publication, and also on the duration of tobacco cessation on cannabis relapse. So, again, short period cessation, from 3 to 10 days didn't seem to change anything in the equation, anything in that association. But there's still so many questions we can ask on this topic. So I'm going to stop here. I wanted to go a little quickly. We acknowledge and thank NIDA for funding and supplying the cannabis, and this is the Division of Substance Use Disorders at Columbia and my Cannabis Research Laboratory. So with that, I have a little bit of time for questions, and then we're going to move on to our next speaker. So if anybody has questions, thank you very much. Hi there.
Thank you for your talk.
Sure.
What was shared here is the behavior of smoking, right, between cannabis and tobacco. Do you think it would map on if you had an individual that used a smokeless tobacco product? Do you think they'd be more susceptible to cannabis relapse?
It's a great question, and we don't know the answer to that. My hypothesis would be yes, because I'm thinking it's nicotine, but you're right, it could be that behavior. But that's why we thought when we had that population not smoke, we could break that link between the behavior, and see if that would break that association, but it didn't. But it's a very good testable hypothesis. Yeah, thanks. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, let's move on. I'd like to introduce Renee Goodwin. I don't have your, so you tell us where you're from, because I don't have it up for me right now, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let's put that right there. Okay. Let me just adjust this. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I'm so excited to have an opportunity to talk about this work today, and thank you, Meg, for putting together this symposium, because this is something that's been fascinating me for several years. Although I would like to take a minute to tell the story about how I came to this question, but let me just see, how do I?
Yeah, just use that to advance.
Use this to advance. All right, so I would like to also, thank NIDA for funding our work. We have no disclosures. This is not where I work, but this is a path where I ride a bicycle, sometimes very safely in the summer, and try to step away from the desk of the craziness of all the things I'm working on. And I find that sometimes it allows me to think about things in a different way and step back. And just in a nutshell here at this time, so most of my work actually focuses on tobacco use and tobacco use outcomes as the problem. And we look at mental health and substance use predictors of those problems, both at a population health level and on an individual level over time, to try to bring the prevalence of tobacco use lower, and especially among vulnerable groups. So that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. But way back, I was trained clinically to be a clinical psychologist, psychodynamically, which is quite different from what I do now. But I also found myself in a position where I needed to teach a class on evidence-based treatments for substance use disorders and mental health problems. And I found this particularly odd because, first, I was not trained in any evidence-based treatments, although there are so many now for tobacco. I didn't care about any of them when I was training. I was totally uninterested. I did not care about substance use disorders at all. It was not my interest. This was a long time ago. And what I cared about even more, even less than any of those things, was cigarette use. So in the settings where I worked, people had severe mental health and substance use problems. But people would come in and everyone smoked, and and we were like, great, to have some cigarettes and go on your cigarette break, and that's not, we would never have occurred to us to put that on a treatment plan. To suggest then that someone would be treated would be cruel and ridiculous. And so as I was thinking about what am I doing now? Does it matter? How is this working? But I said, okay, but nicotine dependence and tobacco use disorder is very different now than it was 20 years ago. There are treatments. It's in the DSM just like everything else. It's a substance use disorder, so the way it must be treated in substance use treatment settings has to be different. We know that co-use of substances is the rule rather than the exception. So when folks go into treatment, presumably tobacco is also a substance that would be treated. But then in talking to people and really thinking about the reality, I realized, this is a quote that someone said to me last week who works with people similar to those that I described. And the idea has always been smoking is the least of people's problems. Maybe it's helpful with remaining abstinent from other drugs. It certainly doesn't hurt, and yet all other substances are treated. And this was not adding up to me, because this is the substance that I study. In another conference I go to, this is the entire problem, tobacco use disorder, tobacco use. And yet, on the other hand, we have people who have remitted and recovery from cocaine use who are using tobacco, and that's not recovery. So it wasn't adding up. And I was like, why, really, as I was riding my bike, like, how does this make sense? We would never have people who are treated for cocaine and alcohol say, like, let's deal with cocaine, and you can go out on the lawn and smoke alcohol when you want to. But that is what happens often in other substance use settings for people who are treated for alcohol and also are addicted to nicotine. So fine. So my next question was, okay, but like there must be evidence for this, because how could it be this way when we're going toward evidence-based treatments? There must be some evidence that using nicotine in the context of being treated for illicit or alcohol use disorders has either no impact or a positive impact. So we could consider the items in black. We don't have a lot of time to talk about them, but more or less, happy to discuss later, nicotine or tobacco meets those criteria. So then I was like, okay, so fine, those things, but then what about the co-use? So if you take people with alcohol and cocaine, maybe not be the best example, but I find it an innocuous one. If we take those folks and we say, like, okay, let's eliminate both immediately because of all these reasons, but another reason is if you use them together, if we say, okay, stop cocaine but continue alcohol, that's not going to be helpful probably in terms of the likelihood of relapse. So what about alcohol and tobacco? Alcohol and tobacco, for many people, are, they're best friends. I mean, they're intimately intertwined for any number of pathways that other folks will discuss. So I thought, if this is the way that treatment works and things are changing, and we'll talk about that, then there must be evidence to show that either cigarette use is helpful for recovery from other substance use disorders, or at least not harmful. So I was like, okay, where is the evidence? And I've been researching and looking for it, and I haven't really been able to find any. So there are some clinical studies, but one thing that interests me about studying people with mental health and substance use disorders and tobacco use in the population is that the majority of people don't come to treatment. So we don't know whether treatment studies actually generalize to most people with these problems. So the questions for today are, is cigarette use then still common among people with active and remitted substance use disorders? As we've heard this morning and other times, cigarette use is declining rapidly. Is cigarette use associated with the risk of relapse to substance use disorders? Is it associated with persistence of current substance use disorders? And may these associations simply be due to confounding by other factors that are disproportionately represented in folks who smoke compared with those who don't? So to get to our first question, well, we saw slides, and we have slides that show that smoking prevalence has declined dramatically in the population. People with substance use disorders, and even those in remission, have not benefited from these programs. So while the population prevalence of cigarette use is around, you could say 15 to 20%, we have 63% of people with cannabis use disorders smoking cigarettes, slightly lower of those in remission, and essentially over half of people with substance use disorder smoking. So in that context, the prevalence is not low, it's not going down, it's very high, and a lot of what I focus on is indeed looking at the prevalence of cigarette smoking and why it is that way in vulnerable groups. This is a very vulnerable group that is, to my mind, very sort of been left behind because it's just assumed, yeah, people with substance use disorder smoke a lot, whatever. I don't believe that, but that's sort of the reaction I get. But let's examine that. What does that mean, and what is it doing? And what is happening by not addressing it? So the next question being, is cigarette use associated with relapse of substance use disorder? So if I don't like to use condoning, but if cigarette use is allowed in substance use treatment facilities, maybe it does help. Maybe that's a positive thing. Not sure what I will do with that finding if that's what we found in terms of a recommendation, but you have to pick your harm reduction stuff. So what we did here is we used the NESARC, which is a nationally representative sample of people ages 18 and over in the U.S. population, sampled first at 2001 to 2, and then followed again at 3 years later. We took people at baseline who had had a lifetime history of substance use disorder, but no use, abuse, dependence within the past year. And our questions here were, among people who were smoking at wave 1, were those who continued to smoke by wave 2 more or less likely to relapse to substance use disorder compared to those who quit? And among people who were lifetime non-smokers at wave 1, were those who initiated smoking by wave 2 more or less likely to relapse versus those who had remained abstinent? Because perhaps taking up smoking would help people get along that pathway, at least over 3 years. So what we found, actually, surprising in a number of ways, but that people who were current smokers at wave 1 were twice as likely to relapse to substance use disorder at wave 2 compared to those who had quit. And among those who were lifetime non-smokers at wave 1 were even more likely to relapse to substance use disorder by wave 2. And these associations were adjusted for a range of demographics, mental health problems. In this situation, substance use didn't. Oh, it's too loud. Didn't include alcohol, so we controlled for alcohol use, problematic alcohol use, nicotine dependence, and the severity of substance use disorder. As we feared, we may be just capturing people with very severe substance use disorder, and maybe that is associated with cigarette use, and so that might be driving it. Those things did not explain the relationship here. So next, I'm just giving you snippets of several studies here. We looked at whether cigarette use was associated with relapsed alcohol use disorder, as I gave the example earlier. So these things are so intertwined, and many people here at the conference and in this room have done just major work in those areas, showing how those are related in clinical and lab samples. And we also looked here at non-daily and daily smoking. With the original thinking, and this was conducted around 2013-14, I thought, more smoking, more drinking, and it would be some sort of dose response. But what we actually found was that daily smoking and non-daily smoking were both associated with increased risk of relapse to alcohol use disorder among those in remission, but the relationship was stronger among those with daily smoking. And it was surprising at first a few years ago. It doesn't surprise me so much anymore, because a lot of work we've been doing looking at daily, non-daily smoking among people with mental health and substance use disorders is consistent with this. And we don't have time, but I'd be happy to discuss later, to get into a discussion of what the meaning of daily and non-daily smoking in the United States today and how it's changing. But anyway, so it wasn't a clear dose response as was measured here. So then more recently, we have been looking at whether cannabis use is cigarette use is associated with persistence and relapse to cannabis use disorder. And in a nutshell here, also just to take a look at, again, breaking down these potential confounders, we find that using the NESARC again, people at wave 1 who had remitted cannabis use disorder who used cigarettes were significantly more likely to have cannabis use disorder 3 years later at wave II, and that these associations were somewhat diminished by controlling for demographics and mental health problems, nicotine dependence, and alcohol, but still remained fairly robust. We also found it was associated with relapsed cannabis use disorder. So key results here, despite the overarching rapid declines in cigarette use among people in the general population or people who are fairly healthy and have a lot of resources, cigarette use remains extremely common among adults with current and remitted substance use disorders. So population approaches or clinical approaches to decrease tobacco use there are not reaching folks and probably not a priority, which is something we're thinking about. Cigarette use is associated with increased risk of relapse to alcohol, cannabis, and substance use disorders, associated with persistence of cannabis use disorder, perhaps the others as well. We just don't have data right now to present that to you. The relations are not completely attributable to demographics, mental disorders, or substance use severity. They may be attributable to other common risk factors that could lead to both, such as a history of trauma, and other factors that we haven't been able to measure yet. But at least for what we know, it's not due to, folks who are smoking have more mental disorders, and that's what's driving it. And finally, the nature of the relationship between cigarette use frequency and the likelihood of relapse remains unclear, and that's something we're looking into further. It's just such a rapidly evolving situation in terms of cigarette use in the United States that even the data we present here, which is a number of years old, may change, or we may see different things soon. So issues for consideration, again, co-use of every other substance is treated in substance use treatment settings, legal or illegal. So we don't know, and other folks will talk about whether this could be a causal relationship or a marker for addiction. We don't know that for a lot of other drugs, but we still treat the drugs. We still treat both. So why, again, does tobacco remain something that seems treated differently? Treatment for tobacco is increasingly optionally provided in substance use treatment settings. It's optional usually, it may or may not be offered, but it's usually still permitted on the grounds, though perhaps not indoors. Increasingly, smoke-free treatment centers are smoke-free, but that largely comes from the idea of a smoke-free workplace and not wanting to expose folks to secondhand smoke, which is great, but the idea that this may not be helpful for recovery hasn't really been presented, and our data suggests that's consistent with our data. It's consistent with clinical data, but I would be open to seeing data that says that it is helpful. There are many implementations issues. This has been, the acceptance of cigarette use in treatment settings has been going on for decades, and so there's a lot of history there, and there's a lot of ambivalence about changing things, and I don't know what the best way is to change them, but based on our data and what we will continue to study, the idea is that increasingly the evidence suggests that it may make sense to bring these together and to fully bring tobacco into the context of substance use treatment. And finally, to educate the public, since so few people go to treatment who have substance use disorders, I don't think people in the public generally think if I'm trying to cut down on alcohol or I'm trying to remain abstinent, maybe I should cut down on cigarettes too. So that's another area to explore. I would like to thank NIDA for funding and Andrea in particular for working so hard on all of this with me, and all of the folks here without whom this could not be possible. And just finally, we have a photo here of folks smoking on an airplane, and which now we're laughing, like, what were we thinking? How is that going on? And my hope here is that someday, maybe in a few years, we'll think the same of smoking in a substance use treatment facility. What was going on? What were we thinking? Were we thinking at all about that? Because based on our data, it's not adding up. Thank you.
I think we have time for one question. I'm going to try to keep a tight schedule here. Yes, go.
Yes, it is. Thank you for such an interesting talk. This is Mahakar Hauserman, addiction psychiatrist. I work at the MD Anderson Cancer Center treating tobacco use every day. And this is one of the things that got me interested actually in tobacco. So one thing that would be interesting to convince the public to treat tobacco in substance use is finding hard evidence, like Dr. Walco's studies showing how methamphetamine gets better after stopping using it 6 months and 1 year on PET scans and fMRIs in the brain. If we were to have two groups, one is smoking, continue to smoke, another who quit, and see how fast they may recover the other substances in the brain. That would be the hardest evidence we could ever find, and that would convince everybody to jump on that wagon instead of us pushing them into, treating tobacco. So
Right.
I don't say that to you because I know you're not doing that kind of study. I'm saying for all of us to move in that direction, hopefully. So.
Right. Yeah, and I agree. And the pushing or the idea that this is what should be done and we should just inflict it on everybody tomorrow won't be good. But some of the evidence does suggest, indeed, that people who quit are less likely to relapse. So the more we can get of that just presented and people can make their choices would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, now we're going to go the other end of the spectrum from epidemiology back to basic science with Amir Levine from Columbia University.
Hi, thank you, Meg, for inviting me to speak here. And it's the first time in this meeting, and I'm really loving it. It's just I'm exposed to so many interesting works. I went through and I looked at all of the posters, and it's really great work. In my lecture today, I'm going to talk about the title of my lecture is From One Experience to Another, a molecular analysis of smoking and subsequent drug use. And I'm a psychiatrist, an adult and a child psychiatrist in my training, and I've always been trained to think about how past experiences change how we respond to future events, which is also known as metaplasticity, sort of an experience on an experience from a biological perspective. And how does one experience registers in the brain to affect another on a molecular level? And I become more and more interested in that when I started doing my basic science work. And specifically, I was interested whether epigenetics plays a role in this, in metaplasticity. So the objectives in this talk, I want to define what epigenetics is and also what is metaplasticity, explain the potential role of nicotine exposure in affecting cocaine exposure on a molecular level in mice, and then discuss the possible benefits of employing epigenetics in future psychiatric treatments. So the idea of metaplasticity is that certain experiences change the synapses in the brain circuitry so that when another experience comes along, the response is different than if the past event did not occur. And I basically designed this, the idea of actually nicotine being the first experience, because in a lot of the sequence of events of how substances are consumed by adolescents, usually kids smoke and drink alcohol first and then move on to marijuana and then to other drugs, although that is also changing. But typically they start with nicotine and alcohol and then they move on to other drugs. And I particularly wanted to look if the exposure to nicotine changes the effect of cocaine, and specifically, does epigenetics play a role in the molecular mechanism of this metaplasticity? And why was I interested about epigenetics? I'm particularly interested in epigenetics because these are universal mechanisms that can lead to new therapeutics in psychiatry. And in this talk, I will actually mention two different drugs. One is SAHA, which is a histone deacetylase inhibitor that's been approved for the use in cancer treatment. And then also all drugs that actually have an epigenetic influence that could potentially be used to new indications. So what is epigenetics? And epigenetics is basically any change in in gene expression that does not involve the change in the genetic code. And in my work, I became particularly interested in, I don't know if this is working. Oh, okay, I see it. I became particularly interested in histone acetylation. And the way that it works is histones are the core, are the proteins in which DNA is compacted on. The DNA is a very long molecule that it has to fit in each and every one of our cells, and it does so by rolling around those histones that look like little Oreo cookies with 4 of them on two sides. But it's a very smart compacting system because it both compacts the DNA but also controls its expression. And the way that you control the expression is by, here you can see this histone protein which are positively charged, and the DNA is negatively charged, so it adheres to it. But you can change that by covering the positive charge with a molecule, like acetylation. And then you diminish the positive charge, and then the DNA loosens, which enables transcription. Otherwise, it's too tight. There's no room for the transcription machinery to go in there. So I looked at histone acetylation. And histone acetylation has been found to be very important for brain function. It plays a function in memory and learning, in neurodegenerative diseases, in maternal behavior, also schizophrenia and depression. And I specifically wanted to look at addiction. And why did I want to look at addiction, and why did I choose nicotine? Because nicotine, it turns out, is a very strong cognitive enhancer. It improves memory and learning. And I come from a lab that studies memory and learning, the molecular mechanism of memory and learning. And memory and learning has a lot of the same molecular pathways in common with addiction. You can think about addiction as a very long, persistent memory. So my question was, is nicotine a primer for addiction to other drugs? And I decided to study this in an animal model, because in animal models, as you can see, in human experiments, you can draw a lot of insight, but it's very hard to come down and really try to understand a mechanism. And animal models can really help us understand mechanism. So I designed an experiment in mice in which mice were exposed to nicotine for 7 days and then were administered cocaine, or the controls were exposed to regular water and then given cocaine as an injection. I also did the opposite experiment where I looked at cocaine first, and then I gave them nicotine. And again, the saline, because they were injected, and then gave them nicotine. What did I do in the study? Where would I look? I looked in the striatum, and specifically also in the nucleus accumbens, which is the area that's very much related to drug reward. I also looked at different behavioral functions and functional outputs in mice. I looked at sensitization and condition-place preference and electrophysiology. And I also studied the some molecular mechanisms. So I focused on the FOSB gene because it's been implicated in drug abuse to all substances, all rewarding substances. And specifically, I then honed in and focused on the FOSB promoter, because if you remember, that's where the replication machine, the transcription machinery has to hone in, and it has to be more loose in order to be able to enable transcription. So let's start with sensitization, and what typically happens with sensitization is that you inject a mouse with cocaine, and it would just over a sequential over a few days, and then it will just run around more and more and more within each day. And what I found was that when you give cocaine alone, you do see the common, and this experiment has been done for many decades, the increase in cocaine in locomotion in a mouse that had been given cocaine. But when you give nicotine first and then you give cocaine, you see that the effect of cocaine has been enhanced dramatically. Next, I moved to look at condition-place preference. And what you do in condition-place preference is that you have this apparatus that has, this is one of them, that has 3 chambers, a small one and 2 big ones that are different, both in how they look and how they feel. The floors are different. And what you do in the first day, you let the mice run around freely, and then you close it down, and you start injecting the mouse with cocaine in one chamber and with saline in another chamber. And then after several days, you let them run around again. And typically what happens is that there's an increase in the time that the mice spent in the cocaine-coupled chamber. And we see that that's actually what happened here in this experiment. But then those mice that got nicotine first and then cocaine, you see an enhancement, a very dramatic enhancement in the time they spent in the cocaine-coupled chamber. So also, very similar to the sensitization, here also there's an increase in the effect of cocaine after nicotine. The next, we turn into electrophysiology, which is another important mechanism to look at functional output. And we actually looked, so here's a little diagram of the brain reward system, and we measured it in slices in the nucleus accumbens, and particularly looking at this inhibitory pathway that goes from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens, and it's important that it's an inhibitory pathway because when we look at LTP, typically what we see that after acute cocaine injection, there's a decrease in LTP. So remember, we inhibit the inhibition, which means that now there's more activity in the nucleus accumbens. So this has been shown again many times that with acute cocaine, there's a decrease in LTP in the nucleus accumbens. But again, when we treat with nicotine and then give cocaine, we see an enhancement of that effect. So then I moved on to molecular studies because I wanted to get a sense of mechanism. So basically what we find with, again, so this is the same idea. When we look at FOSB gene expression, there's an increase in FOSB after cocaine injection. But when you give nicotine and cocaine, you see a much bigger enhancement. And then when you do the opposite, you don't really see that. So then the question is, what is the mechanism by which this works? And I was surprised to find that nicotine is a very potent, increases histone acetylation in a very potent way in the striatum, both for histone H3 and H4. But the question is, how does it do it? And then we found that it actually inhibits HDAC. So if you inhibit the histone deacetylase, that there's less acetylation being removed, and you increase acetylation. And nicotine is a potent HDAC inhibitor. So next we moved, and I'll try to be quick because I don't have a lot of time, but we moved to examine 2 pharmacological interventions to sort of that first SAHA, an HDAC inhibitor. So basically you can think about nicotine as an HDAC inhibitor, and then would SAHA actually mimic the effects of nicotine? And we find that it does, and you can see even, it's almost like a mirror image. This is the nicotine slide that I showed you before, and this, instead of nicotine, we gave SAHA, and we see a huge increase in FOSB expression when we treat the mice with SAHA first and then nicotine. We see the same thing in electrophysiology. This is the nicotine slide that I showed you before, and this is with SAHA. So nicotine, then cocaine, a reduction in LTP, much more so than just the cocaine. And this is SAHA with nicotine, a reduction in LTP, much more so with just with cocaine alone. So then we wanted to look at the opposite. Basically, we did that with 2 approaches, but I'm only going to talk about one today, which is about theophylline. And it turns out that low-dose theophylline can actually decrease acetylation. And this is the experiment where we can see how it increased acetylation in histone H4 acetylation, specifically in K12 and K16. But then what we get is actually the opposite. When we treat with theophylline first and then give cocaine, we see a reversal of the effect on LTP. So it's as if the mice almost never really received cocaine if they were actually treated with theophylline first. And then same thing with FOSB expression. So these mice, so this is the increase in cocaine with FOSB after cocaine injection, and these mice actually received theophylline first, and they were injected with cocaine, but in terms of the molecular machinery, it's basically shut down, and you don't really see the expression of FOSB. So a quick summary is that nicotine acts as an HDAC inhibitor. It inhibits HDACs, sets the stage for increase in unopposed histone acetylation. That leads to FOSB expression, and increasing FOSB expression increases the activity phenotype. So quickly, I want to talk about what happens in adolescence. And as people mentioned here, it's a time where there's increased vulnerability to addiction. So we looked at histone acetylation, and to my surprise, I found that actually, even at baseline, there's an increase in histone acetylation. And you remember, and that may actually also explain why adolescents are really good at learning things. They can really soak up things, and even if you would remember anything from this talk, it means that some sort of histone acetylation happened in your brain to promote long-term memory. And if you don't, then probably no. So as you can see, adolescents are really good learners, but that also translates to FOSB and delta FOSB expression. They naturally have that higher in baseline than older mice. So basically, the adolescent brain is extremely sensitive to all drugs of abuse, including nicotine. And basically with that, I'm going to stop. I just want to thank my mentors and also the people who helped me do this work, and NIDA for the support. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Amira. Perhaps you can ask him questions afterwards. I want to give time to our discussant, Jennifer Tidy, who's going to try to bridge the histonoacetylation to epidemiology link.
I'm going to bridge the gap. How do I advance? And how do I... Okay.
And the problem with, there's two projectors, so when we're ignoring that side of the room.
Okay. Sorry for people who sat over there. So I'm Jennifer Tidy. I'm at Brown University, where I do human laboratory research and some clinical trials research, mainly in tobacco and people with some substance use disorders, but mainly people with serious psychiatric disorders. And I have no conflicts of interest. My work is supported by NIDA and FDA. This is Providence, Rhode Island. So this is my building here. You're all invited to come visit me, and we'll go out for calamari, which is our state appetizer in Rhode Island. It's delicious, fried calamari. So tobacco is the leading cause of preventable death in the United States. It's responsible for almost 500,000 deaths per year and costs the U.S. over $300 billion per year in healthcare costs and lost productivity costs. Tobacco, it increases the risk of heart disease 2 to 4 times. It's responsible for 90% of lung cancer deaths, for 80% of COPD deaths, and increases the risk of stroke 2 to 4 times. And although the rates of smoking are historically low in the United States, which is an incredible public health victory, this obscures the continued persistent high rates of smoking among vulnerable populations, including the population we're talking about today, the populations we're talking today, people with substance use disorders, where we've heard from Renee that over 50% of adults with alcohol and substance use disorders are smokers, and where studies show that among adolescents and young adults, this is true also, over 50% of young adult cannabis use smokers have smoked cigarettes in the past 30 days. And furthermore, smoking is associated with severity of cannabis use and cannabis use disorder. And as we heard from Dr. Volkow this morning, another incredible public health victory is the very low rate of cigarette smoking and combustible product use among teens. But this is offset perhaps by the alarming jump in e-cigarette use, which happened in 2018, which is of course raising concerns that kids who are using e-cigarettes now may convert to using cigarettes down the line. And furthermore, we have an early signals that, just like we heard from from both speakers ahead of me, that nicotine in cigarettes can serve as a gateway. There's early evidence that nicotine in e-cigarettes and hookah, or at least e-cigarette and hookah use, are also serving as gateways to cannabis use. And so in a longitudinal study of 9th graders from 10 public schools in California reporting never having used cannabis at baseline, e-cigarette and hookah use were associated with 3.6 to 4-fold increases in the odds of initiating and currently using cannabis 2 years later. Furthermore, we're seeing evidence of a reverse gateway effect where longitudinal studies from both NESARC and PATH data are showing that cannabis use is associated with cigarette use. So it's among non-smokers, cannabis use increases initiation of cigarette use, Among cigarette current users, cannabis use is associated with not quitting, and among former smokers, cannabis is associated with relapse. So we have gateway in both directions now. So altogether, this is a pretty alarming situation. We heard some of the factors contributing to co-use from Dr. Levine ahead of me. We've also talked a little bit about other potential underlying risk factors that may underlie co-use of tobacco and other drugs. I've put up some here. There are just a host, obviously, of potential factors, both biological and environmental, including, of course, the high rates of depression and anxiety among both tobacco use and other tobacco users and other substance users. Sensation seeking, path data showing sensation seeking is a risk factor for tobacco. Steep discounting of delayed rewards, common to all people with substance use disorders and tobacco use disorders, so perhaps not being so concerned with delayed health consequences of tobacco and other substances. Low cognitive control or executive function, so making it very difficult for you to carry out your planned behavior. You intend to quit smoking, but that is a very difficult thing to do. And to continue to do it every day and to think about it and to keep it uppermost and to turn down opportunities requires a lot of executive function. And then anhedonia, we know that tobacco increases the reinforcing effects of a variety of reinforcers. Intolerance of distress or discomfort, making it very difficult to tolerate withdrawal. And drug availability, peer use, these environmental factors that are setting the stage. And of course, they're not mutually exclusive. It doesn't have to be gateway versus common risk factors. It's most likely a combination, where one is setting creating the opportunity and the other is then directly priming substance use. And so I have several research and treatment implications I wanted to touch on. I'm actually not going to touch on the first one because Meg talked about it, and I think it's clear from her data how important it is to consider tobacco use when we do both human laboratory studies and clinical trials, to consider tobacco use as a potential moderator to try to control for or stratify on tobacco use or tobacco use severity, or at least to look at tobacco as a moderator of potential outcomes in your trials of potential treatments for substance use disorders. I think it can really be informative. And then I want to touch briefly on the importance of smoking cessation services for being integrated into substance use treatment, and also talk a little bit about some potential novel way of treating tobacco or reducing tobacco use in the U.S. that hopefully will also help, but at least not harm, substance use outcomes. So turning to substance use treatments, many substance use treatments still don't address tobacco. I think it's because substance use disorders are more immediately disruptive to functioning and to quality of life than tobacco. I think that the delayed discounting is very important. The impact of tobacco on health, while extremely profound, is delayed. And that therefore, we may all, patients, families, researchers, treatment providers, just discount the significance of treating tobacco. Smoking, as we've heard, is often seen as a necessary crutch for people in substance use treatment. Among patients, their families, and their treatment providers are all very concerned about jeopardizing sobriety and removing tobacco. And then often substance use treatment providers feel unqualified, and other healthcare providers, to treat tobacco. So the good news is that substance use treatments is a great opportunity to address tobacco. Studies, while not incredibly numerous, the bulk of evidence shows that smoking cessation does not impede and often improves response to substance treatment. And in fact, recent studies show that while we typically think of people with substance use disorders as being unmotivated to quit, that is changing. And people who are engaging in substance use treatment now are interested in quitting, as a recent study by Dustin Lee showed. And in fact, as far as treatment providers feeling unqualified to address tobacco, brief in-person training and very recent study on using online training was showing improvements in tobacco treatment knowledge and tobacco treatment among behavioral health care professionals. That said, I think smokers with substance use disorders need appropriate treatment, and by appropriate, I mean intensive treatment. I don't think this is an area where we can get by with minimal treatments. When you think about impaired executive function and all the other risk factors, we need intensive treatments. We need the maximal treatments. I think contingency management has a lot to offer. We've done some work at Brown University, led by my colleague, Dr. Rosenau, Damaris Rosenau, looking at contingency management combined with nicotine replacement compared to non-contingent reinforcement, combined with nicotine replacement, and found that it was very efficacious during treatment, continued to be significant post-treatment, although the effect size was small. And then Maxine, a few hours ago, talked about how the 21st century is ripe for contingency management. So this is an area where I think contingency management can really be helpful. Medications, of course, are an important part of this treatment approach, especially varenicline. Meg talked about varenicline. We've also done some work with varenicline in people with substance use disorders at Brown and found that it was quite effective in a 12-week treatment among. These were outpatients in early recovery from substance use disorders, and you can see that there was a lot of comorbidity among substance use disorders in that sample. And now I want to switch briefly to reducing the nicotine content of smoking as a potential regulatory approach to reducing tobacco in the US. So recognizing that people smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar, Benowitz and Henningfield in 1994 proposed reducing the nicotine content of cigarettes as a way of reducing tobacco dependence in the US, might reduce the initiation of tobacco smoking and also help people who are already smokers to quit smoking. And in 2009, the FDA acquired, through the Tobacco Control Act, acquired regulatory authority over tobacco products, making this an actual possibility. And since then, there have been numerous trials of reducing the nicotine content of cigarettes among smokers who are not trying to quit and looking at effects on smoking. I'm going to talk about one of those trials in particular because we've also looked at effects on other substance use. And so this was a trial, a multi-site trial. Brown was one of the sites, and it was conducted by Eric Donnie. And 10 sites with 840 smokers, again, not trying to quit. And they were randomized to cigarettes varying in nicotine content. They either got their usual brand or they got research cigarettes that were, administered under double-blind conditions, varying from 15.8 milligrams per gram tobacco, which is comparable to a commercial cigarette, down to a very low level of 0.4 milligram per gram. And you can see what we collect data using daily IVR, and then there were weekly in-person visits looking at dependence, looking at nicotine exposure and tobacco toxin exposure, craving, mood, some psychiatric outcomes, and smoking topography. And what was found in this trial is that below 2.4 milligrams per gram, cigarette smoking was reduced, nicotine exposure was reduced, cigarette dependence was reduced. This is the Fagerstrom score, not including cigarettes per day. So even when you take this out of the Fagerstrom score, dependence was reduced. And actually, even though these smokers were not trying to quit attempts increased dose-dependently with people in the very low nicotine content group having the most quit attempts after the trial. Furthermore, a secondary analysis looked at effects in young adults, which we've talked about as being a very important period. This is a vulnerable time with a lot of smoking uptake. So what are the effects of nicotine reduction in younger adults versus older adults? So in the trial that I just described, what we found, if you look at the left-hand graphs on the slide, you'll see effects at week 2. And you can see that in younger adults, who are the solid bar, they were actually more sensitive to the reduction in nicotine. So they, at week 2, they were already saying, we don't like these cigarettes and we're not smoking as much, whereas the older adults were still persisting longer. Now, by week 6, the older adults had also had caught up with the younger adults, but there's no indication that younger adults were more inclined to persist smoking very low nicotine content cigarettes, which is very reassuring. And then looking at potential effects on alcohol and other substance use. So you might think through mediation that reducing the nicotine content of cigarettes, well, we would reduce nicotine exposure, which we just heard from Dr. Levine, we would assume would reduce then drug use. On the other hand, if people are going through nicotine withdrawal, maybe they're going to increase their drug use, alcohol and other drug use, as a way of coping with withdrawal. On the other hand, maybe because there's a lot of cross-cue reactivity between tobacco and alcohol, tobacco and other substances, maybe reducing your smoking would reduce your substance use, alcohol and substance use. And in fact, so what was found, these are effects on standard drinks, and there's a thing here. So in the first 2 weeks, what was found was that people assigned to the very low nicotine content cigarette condition were drinking less, and then it pretty much plateaued after that. But there was no indication that reducing the nicotine content of cigarettes led to increases in drinking. And in fact, looking at mediation, those effects were mediated both through a reduction in nicotine exposure and a reduction in cigarettes. So it doesn't answer the marker versus direct pharmacological effects of nicotine. It looks like in this study, it looked like both. And then, so quickly, some studies in users of cannabis and other drugs. So another secondary analysis from the Donnie et al. Multi-site trial found that, similar with alcohol, reducing the nicotine content of cigarettes did not change cannabis. Everybody, whether they were a cannabis user at baseline or not, reduced their smoking. So again, reassuring findings that this potential regulatory approach could reduce tobacco without compromising, jeopardizing other substance use. And then secondary results from another trial, very low nicotine content cigarettes. This is from the Steve Higgins Center on very low nicotine content cigarettes in vulnerable populations, found similar effects. Nicotine reduction reduced cigarette liking and cigarette behavioral measure of reinforcement, both in people who did and didn't use cannabis similarly. So again, no cause for concern that it could increase drug use. And finally, very preliminary results from another study that I'm familiar with at Brown found that 6 weeks of very low nicotine content cigarettes is reducing smoking and also reducing drug use days. So, and there are more studies coming out that I'm aware of too. So far it looks very promising. So I will just pop up my implication slide again, getting back to the 3 points that I've been trying to make. The importance of studying tobacco, tobacco use and tobacco use severity as a moderator, so that we can understand this phenomenon better. The importance of incorporating smoking cessation services, which I think everybody's on board with. I'm an editor for nicotine and tobacco research, so I see a lot of articles, and there's a lot more awareness, and that's very exciting. But I think also we have to consider flipping the default and making tobacco treatment the assumption. Meeting people where they're at, for sure, but also assuming that when people come in for substance use treatment that we will address their tobacco, not offering it, assuming that we will do it. And also, again, some exciting new findings about the potential of the regulatory approach of reducing the nicotine content of cigarettes. And with that, I will leave you another beautiful slide of Rhode Island. Come visit. This is the time to do it. Thank you.
So I really want to thank all my speakers. You know, we are over time, but I don't think they're kicking us out of the room quite yet. So if anybody has any questions for any of the speakers, please let us know, and we could attempt. We actually are getting kicked out of the room. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.